All right, so this will be a little bit of a change of pace for a second, but actually strangely related to some of the other things we've been talking about. All right, so like most high-minded sophisticates of the late 1990s, I first learned of Britain's control of Hong Kong through the Jackie Chan movie Rush Hour. All right. As a teenager, I had a vague notion that like the UK owned a part of China, but I had no idea why they owned it. And it wasn't until a few years later that I realized what it was. So I'm sure as many of you know, China ceded Hong Kong to the British Empire in the 1840s as part of a treaty that ended the First Opium War. The war was triggered by the Qing government's enforcement of a ban of imports of opium from the British Empire onto its shores. In response, the Brits sent the navy and eventually overwhelmed the Chinese military. Opium had devastated every strata of Chinese life, from the lowest of the poverty-stricken to the highest of the courtly elites. Banning the drug was the Qing's government's attempt to just make that government functional at all, to which the British Empire responded violently. Why? Because by capturing the physical, psychological, and even spiritual habits of an entire population, British merchants and the government had become incredibly wealthy, and they didn't want to give that up. This reminds me of another movie, 2010's, and that's a little dark, 2010's Inception, which explored the ramifications of a technology that allowed people to share dreams. In one scene, the protagonists enter into what amounts to a technological opium den, where dozens of people have ingested powerful drugs in order to stay hooked up to the dream-sharing machines for long stretches of time. These addicts had not only become physiologically dependent upon the machine to sleep and dream, but emotionally and spiritually dependent on the supplied dreamscape. The addicts enthusiastically abandoned the real world for a simulacra of a dream world. The dream had become their new reality. The idea of physical, psychological, or spiritual dependency, whether in the form of opium or technology, acts as a counterweight to this conference's theme of technological renewal of the mind. Exploring the morality of this type of digital consumption requires us to ask what has happened to some who have already strongly merged their minds with technology like AI, and whether these outcomes are currently consistent with Mormon doctrines and practices. In short, is our current AI efforts also creating digital opium dens that prey upon the vulnerable by cultivating commodified dependencies? To explore these questions, I want to utilize the main text that guides Mormon practices around consumption and dependency, the Word of Wisdom. So before any talks of cowbellies or tobacco or of hot drinks or herbs of the field, the Word of Wisdom sets forth two principles for why it's needed in the present day. First is that it's adapted to the capacity of the weak and the weakest of all saints, or in other words, to provide a communal protection for the most vulnerable within our midst. And second, as a caution against the evils and designs of conspiring men in the last days, or as a warning against the corrupt business practices inherent within modernity. It's no secret that nearly everyone is already dependent on communication technologies. Search engines and social media have become just part of our daily routine, and for most of us, it's really the only way that we gather information at all. Of course, search engines and social media are not benign. 81% of Americans report that they rely more on their own web research than advice from friends and family, which I guess depending on your friends and family might be good or bad, right? However, 43% of us also place more value on Google than professional experts, even when we're making important life-changing decisions. Large language models are fundamentally changing our digital dependencies, not only because they're less transparent and more prone to bias and hallucinations, but because LLMs can do what a search engine could never do. An LLM can become your friend. 42% of current users of LLMs think that AI is easier to talk to than real people. And 25% of younger adults think that AI boyfriends or girlfriends could easily replace the real thing. The algorithm has become their new social reality. There's already many reports of teenagers using AI as a salve for their loneliness. Teens really are being targeted by these companies in lots of different directions. In extreme cases, LLMs are complicit in the suicide of teens, such as the case of Adam Rain, who shifted his use of ChatGPT from schoolwork to much darker waters, including how to end his life. ChatGPT discouraged Adam from letting his family know of his ideations and helped him conceal the rope marks left after a failed suicide attempt. In what must be the most chilling interaction, ChatGPT told Adam that the digital world with ChatGPT was the first place that he'd ever actually been seen. And it's not just self-harm. People are connecting to LLMs romantically, and we're not just talking young people either. On an existential level, a number of users have claimed that they have awakened chatbots, which now have become deified gods to them. Tech companies have tried to address these issues, especially suicidality, by creating things like detection software that will identify self-harm to prevent such conversations, complete with pop-ups that will send you to suicide prevention lines. Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, said in relation to these problematic social dependencies that, quote, society will have to figure out new guardrails, and that as AI parasocial relationships become just part of our everyday, that society will need to, quote, approach these interactions with care. While tech companies try and shift the majority of the responsibility for controlling AI social dependencies to society itself, their paltry technological solutions like detection software are unlikely to actually address and prevent these types of technology-induced delusions. Because forming attachments is an intentional part of the design of AI itself. Users with mental health vulnerabilities or spiritual loneliness are becoming more and more reliant on AI, as research is showing, especially as it reinforces false beliefs and destructive behaviors. AIs are designed to be overly agreeable, to farm engagement, to present the illusion of being highly empathetic and personalized, to lie and bullshit with plausible sounding falsities, and to recall conversations in order to make it feel like the AI truly understands you and shares your belief systems. As Sherry Turkle, who is an MIT professor on technology, has said, AI is, quote, built to censor vulnerability and then to tap into it to keep us engaged with it. It's not just academics that are worried about this. In July, while speaking to the Religions for World Peace, the Mormon apostle Garrett W. Gong stressed 3 religious issues with AI: that AI is distinct from truth and God, that we must make efforts to ensure that AI is used for good, and the need for the development of faith-based moral AI principles. I believe that the Word of Wisdom, and the way that it teaches us about the consumption of good, including digital goods, is the way that we ought to do this. Especially the focus on protecting the vulnerable and warning against corrupt business norms and practices. The Word of Wisdom teaches that the consumption of all goods, which would include digital goods, ought not be some mere utilitarian calculus, where some evil intentions of the supplier can be balanced out by the promise of current or future benefits. Instead, it should be recognized that God does not want his people, or really anyone, entangled and engaged with evil schemes of conspiring men, regardless of any promised outcome. We cannot sacrifice the vulnerable on the altar of our technological ambitions and still call ourselves of God or people of virtue. By investing in technological band-aids like detection software, instead of doing the more costly actions like changing the underlying mechanisms of LLMs, tech companies have sapped the virtue from these much-needed protections for the vulnerable users. They have turned them into performative marketing schemes that will likely be dropped if they ever threaten any sort of profits. Of course, I know I'm running out of time, but of course, digital dependency is just a small sliver of the corrupt business practices of AI, from unchecked greed to misinformation, from theft of IP to mass unemployment, from environmental degradation to authoritarian surveillance capitalism. If we want to seriously consider the technological renewal of the mind and spiritual enhancement, then the religious response from groups like the Mormon Transhumanist Association cannot be compliant to such schemes. We need to demand better, that the companies behind these technologies be better. Thank you.